I'd like to now discuss invisible structures. These are types of structures or systems, dynamics, things that you don't see with your naked eye or with sense with your normal senses, but they exist in our world and they're really important for supporting and making other structures and other systems work. Let's go on to the first examples in the next slide. So invisible structures are countering all the things we've talked about so far, in the sense that we've mostly discussed visible things, elements like earthworks, swales, terraces, gabions, plants, buildings like tool sheds or chicken coop, organisms, the livestock you might have on your farm or in your any kind of design system you're thinking of, the soils, people, roads, trails, access points, water, technology, the actual pieces of technology, automobiles, cash, produce from the gardens, books. That's are just some examples of visible structures, tangible elements and things within your permaculture design system. Invisible structures are all those things that are also important to your system, but they're not visible, mostly, like the electrical energy that's moving through the wires or through the atmosphere in a wireless system. Those things are not visible, so to speak. They're invisible, but they are really important in keeping our system working as it does. Solar radiation, it's pretty much invisible, but it has a huge impact on our planet and organisms and everything else. Sound waves, you're listening to my voice now, but it is not a thing that you see. It's sensed and received in a different way, so that's considered an invisible dynamic or structure in the context of this lecture. We call them structures. Monetary systems are largely invisible too, especially now that most money that's exchanged is digital. It's really not some tangible thing. Social systems, knowledge, laws, regulations, policies. The microbial world is largely invisible to humans, but it has a huge impact on organisms and our planet and even just our garden soils, from the large to the small scale. Wind, time, ethics, imagination, spirituality, diseases, pollution, a lot of small elements that we can't see that cause pollution, emotions, traditions. You can go on, but these are things that are basically invisible to the human eye, but they have a large impact. And there's things to be considered. So this is what this whole topic is about. When Bill Mollison wrote his book, The Designer's Manual, he has hundreds of pages, and he considers the chapter on invisible structures the most important to recognize when designing a permaculture sustainable design. We have to incorporate social systems and all these other invisible structures into the design and consider them, or it will fail. It will not be sustainable. So important, and just giving you some examples there. One really great example is just our U.S. Monetary system. A little bit first about the history of the U.S. currency and our system is, and some of you are historians and will know much more about this than I do. But for those that want just a little recap, we decided that at some point the colonists in early America, they decided they didn't want to be taxed by England. They had no representation in England about what these taxes should be used for, and they didn't even get some of the tax money back, but they were being taxed by things that were sent over. And they didn't want taxation without representation. And they kind of threw that on its head, which didn't make England too happy and caused a Revolutionary War. And when U.S. colonies actually started printing their own money, kind of saying we're going to have our own monetary system. It's going to be decentralized instead of the centralized one, central in England. And that started the Revolutionary War. Americans were overall, in one way of looking at it, is we're fighting to get away from this central banking system that they weren't represented by and they weren't a part of. Nowadays, imagine some kind of analog to that. You say, I'm going to not participate in these Federal Reserve notes, the US monetary system. If you don't do that, you can be definitely dinged by the IRS by not paying taxes. It's considered sometimes a criminal offense. And it can be a big deal to not partake in what is really a central banking system here in the United States. But early on, we were against it because it was not fair. If you really take a deep look at the US banking system and monetary system, it is largely benefiting private interests. So a little bit about the history. And this is a nice little timeline showing you different types of events that happened that led up to current monetary system situation. But a couple of times throughout history, the United States leaders did not want to be part of a centralized banking system, and they got in trouble for that. One of them was President Andrew Jackson in 1832. He led a successful effort by Congress to retake control of America's money supply from this private interest family, the Rothschilds, by refusing to renew the charter for the Second Bank of America, this centralized banking system that was giving the profits from the interest to private families like the Rothschilds. So, and not until 1913 would that same family, the Rothschilds, be able to set up their third central bank. So there was a good chunk of time when the United States banking system was not serving private interests. Some think that his assassination attempt may have been linked to this, from him he was unpopular for trying to uphold this decentralized US bank system. Otherwise, the United States banking system has been largely centralized and largely serving private interests, making a few wealthy families wealthier. It wasn't about dissemination of power and resources. It wasn't about fair share, as we say in permaculture ethics, redistribute the surplus. No, it was about concentrating surplus into a few families that had a lot of surplus. The Rockefellers, Carnegies, Rothschilds, Harrimans, they all were families that had a lot of money built on empires from different things, oil, railroad, etc., and banking. And those were the ones that controlled the banking system and industry in New York, which was the banking industry of the United States. It was a central part of that. So a lot of the interest and earnings went to those families. And even in 1900, the Rothschild family controlled half of the world's wealth. This is a very, very wealthy family and influential family. Part of the problem, if you think in the terms of wanting the US banking system, that it would be better and more sustainable to be decentralized. And again, I bring these all up, this example up, not to, point a finger at the US banking system, or not to incite revolution towards the banking system, but to just illustrate how something that's set up that's so centralized is not ecological, and therefore it's not sustainable in the long run. Ecosystems are not like that, where all these resources keep being funneled to one organism or one species over and over and over for decades, in over 100 years. It creates a very weak system, an unstable system. Decentralization is often politically not popular because it gives power and resources and money to the common person. But ecosystems are like that. Biomass, energy elements are in an open metabolism. They're redistributed rather readily, relatively quickly. They're not held by one organism. So our banking systems are going against what the rest of the operating system of the world goes by if you look at ecological systems. Continuing on with our chronology of events of the development of the US banking system, in 1912, some of the wealthiest families met on Jekyll Island, South Carolina, for a private retreat. They met without government lawmakers. These were the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, Harrimans, and a few others. And they created this idea and document that outlined what they called the Federal Reserve Bank, that would be privately owned by a few families and those which would become US banks later. It would create a more centralized banking system, taking it back from the decentralized system that had been in place ever since Andrew Jackson's time. And a year later, President Woodrow Wilson, under his presidency, this was signed into law. It was that this Federal Reserve Bank would be our national bank, controlling the money supply and monetary policies. The Federal Reserve Bank Board was appointed by the U.S. president, but control is still within the families like the Rothschilds. So this, again, made the official U.S. banking system one that provides profits by interest to a few families. It's like a private company that is dealing with our public funds. Even President Trump, wasn't able to break that Rothschild's family financial grip and try to influence the Federal Reserve Bank. It's still, our federal banking system is still influenced by those few private interests where we don't have representation. Most people do not. So that's kind of what we're dealing with now. And again, it's important to know the system. I had one student a few years ago who did not use what she would say, I do not use Federal Reserve notes. Those are the things you call $1 or a $5 bill, a $20 bill. She's like, I don't use those. I will not partake in that system. And she dealt with her bills and things in other ways. And some of them were not very popular, trying to argue with people about how she's not going to give them money, but she'll give them other things. That doesn't always work. As part, though, of our mindset of how it has to be done comes from this centralized banking system that we have, which really does not serve, it's not about redistribution of surplus. It doesn't serve all the people very well. It serves them to a degree, but overall, it's making the top, the most wealthy even wealthier. If you look a little further, even in 1995, the Rothschilds family controlled an estimated 80% of the world's uranium reserves, and that gives that family a monopoly over nuclear power. Only 7 nations in the world, China, Iran, Afghanistan, North Korea, Sudan, and Cuba, and Libya, did not have Rothschild-controlled central banks. So we're still dealing with the domination of even the world's financial system by one or even a few families. That is not a sustainable system, in my opinion. And that's why I bring it up as an example of an invisible structure which has vast influence on what happens here as far as resources and energy and even design goes. There's a book that was written by Edward Griffin about that meeting on Jekyll Island and what he kind of dramatizes to say like this kind of the creature, but like the monster Federal Reserve Bank that was created by these families to centralize our banking system back in 1912. It's a very interesting read. And if you were still kind of confused about this, our Federal Reserve Bank, it runs on what's called a fractional reserve system. And this diagram kind of explains it, how the interest that is paid is reinvested by the bank. They're making money off of our money, much more than we get in return. Here's an example of some social, political types of relationships that are invisible, but that affect our everyday lives to a great extent through money management and resource management and regulations. This is showing you the overlap in the personnel between some government committees and political roles, and those same people serve in private interests, like in big oil companies, Goldman Sachs banking, Monsanto, pharmaceutical companies, people that are serving on both. This, in my opinion, does not make objective public servants. It makes very biased public servants, which means they're not really serving the public overall very well. And again, this isn't very well based on an ecological type of framework where there would be a lot more open sharing of ideas and resources and biomass and energy between different elements, not trying to one private interest trying to get more than it needs or get to take away from others. That happens in ecosystems to some degree, but it's very quick. The rate of give and take is very quick and fast, so things stay pretty horizontal and level as far as power and energy and resources goes. These systems you're looking at here, this is showing you that these are long-term biases that create big divisions and instability in our political, social, and industrial designs. So I should have said this at the beginning, but I'll say it now, that this lecture gets into a lot of social and political ideas, and I'm representing and describing one's, my slant of what I see. I think I'm being objective when I talk about these invisible structures, but I have biases too. So you all are smart enough and able to filter out and disagree with what I'm saying and thinking, and that's good. We need as much of that as we can get, because the biases are important and they're natural, but they also keep us from understanding a greater complexity of interrelatedness that we have. This is a picture of some of the interrelatedness of companies. I liked this when I first saw this because I liked to think the things that I buy were natural and organic and so healthy and supportive of things I cared about, like the environment and human health. And some of them are, but it's good to know that they're also connected to these larger, big centralized corporations, which overall have a big negative impact on the environment and perhaps some negative impacts on social systems too, just by the fact that they are producing products that aren't all healthy for people. So if you are someone whose family or people work for one of these companies, there are great aspects of these companies, and some of them are really wonderful. This is just to show you the interconnectedness of them and to help you understand. It's really about transparency, knowing what you purchase, if you consider that a vote, that is also giving to this greater company, this other thing that you may not want to vote for with your dollar. This is a similar diagram from about 12 years ago, showing you the organic industry and what companies own and produce your favorite organic products. When about 20 years ago, I used to buy Odwalla, that juice, and it was considered one of the first really healthy, natural, organic juices. And I see here that it's owned by Coca-Cola, which I would probably, and I love Coca-Cola to drink, but it's also something that you see all over the world. I'm not so sure it's supporting our ecosystems or our humanity's health either. So just good to know who owns what. And another example of transparency, understanding the true environmental type of slant of some of the major companies. I know when my wife and I decided to first make some investments, we had enough money to invest. We asked our broker, we said we want to invest in stocks that of companies that support environmental and social justice. So the highest list of companies, well, not the highest, but like the top few biggest companies that were considered environmentally and socially conscious were Starbucks, Apple Computer, Home Depot, and those are the ones I remember. And I just remember thinking, okay, that's great. That means that those companies themselves try to do something socially and environmentally that are better. But also knowing that those companies and realizing how much waste they produce and how many toxic chemicals they produce, it's good to know that they're not saying that those companies are perfectly environmentally and socially conscious or just. It's just saying they're doing some things that qualify them to be an environmentally and socially just company. So it's just good to think about. Here on this list of basically fast food companies, only Subway is doing anything positive for the environment. Really, all these other ones, even if they say they do this or that, they really have no environmental objectives that are positive. So bringing these invisible structures, especially if they're social and political, bringing them into the visible spectrum. That's what transparency is all about. When people say transparency, we need to bring things that were implicit or hidden or invisible and make them more visible. I wanted to mention this man, Noam Chomsky, who was an American linguist, philosopher, social critic, political activist. He wrote a number of books. Some of them were very interesting. I found this one to be extremely interesting and pertinent to this topic, called Manufacturing Consent. And it was a while ago, so before social media, but at that time, media like newspapers, radio, TV, film, media businesses, the way they edited what they wanted the public to see, what was presented to the public, distorted really what was happening. So the distortions favored the government and corporate policies. So what we were seeing on the news or hearing on the radio was edited. Only certain things were told. There wasn't some huge conspiracy of someone guiding this, but overall, if we have radio stations and TV stations and newspapers that are owned by private interests, what they're going to report on is going to mostly support their own interests. It's certainly not going to fly directly against their interests. So what we hear in the media is distorted towards private interests and to keep those businesses in power and gaining more power. So it's part of it is our belief and lack of will. It's to effect change is instilled through that selective media exposure, according to Chomsky. So we're told this story and we think that's the truth, so we don't question it, so we don't think we can change anything, and we don't know that we are kind of being led in a certain direction. And in this case, our monetary system, we're being led towards more wealth in a smaller number of individuals in the country rather than dissemination of wealth. And especially at this time of 1988 and before that, being a communist was seen as really awful, big enemy. So you wouldn't want to talk about dissemination of power and resources because then you might be a communist. Oh, that's really bad. But basically he's saying that the media keeps us kind of numbed out to what's really happening, so we don't even think we can make a change or don't think that we need to make a change, but to be aware that what we're being fed is distorted. Now, with the last few years, we've heard a lot about fake news, so I think it's come into our consciousness that everything we see in the media is biased, and bias is coming out all over the place. People are realizing bias. So that's an important, huge step since Chomsky wrote this book. But it's something to still consider. And with permaculture design, it's just another way we need to keep trying to identify invisible structures. Don't let them stay invisible, because if we don't incorporate them into our designs and our systems, we'll have problems later and we won't know where they came from. This way we can try to address them, at least start to. Let's think for a moment about the true kind of historical meaning of money. When you're giving someone money to get something, what are you communicating to them by giving them money? Money is supposed to communicate confidence, time was put into that product, a trust that it's valuable. This is life energy that you did. Let's say someone made a basket and you're buying it from them. That's their life energy that they put into that, and services, knowledge. It's an agreement to give them something for that. Those are some of kind of the background, real deeper things that are behind the representation of money. Some alternative economies have popped up in the last 20 to 30 years. These are systems that are not part of the Federal Reserve Bank. They are alternative, basically bartering economies. Some of the best known are the Ithaca dollar and the Marin barter exchange, where you have a relatively small community and you have a lot of service people buy into it, saying, hi, I'm going to sign up for the Ithaca dollar system. I am a massage therapist, and a dentist could sign up, and a carpenter, whoever. And when they go work at someone's house, they earn Ithaca dollars, and then those dollars can be used. They can use those Ithaca dollars to go to the dentist with. But it's really a time and services exchange. And these are still pretty hard for the IRS to track. So they work, and they've been around quite a while. It's kind of back to the old bartering system, except it's not two people, one person giving, like it's not like the carpenter goes to the masseuse for the massage and then the masseuse has the carpenter build something. This could be you do something for one person, then you kind of earn these Ithaca dollars or alternative monetary value. They're not even considered monetary, you just earn these like hours or stars, something like that, and those can be used for another service within that small community. The Santa Barbara has a system, it did, called it Santa Barbara Time Bank. It's not very vital. LA has a time bank that's a little more vital. A lot of places all over the nation have these systems, but they haven't completely taken off, but they are a great idea of an alternative economy that keeps things more local, more sustainable, and more horizontally disseminated. And it's not all doom and gloom. We need to see some positive changes of things that have happened. So positive change of financial systems being more in sync with ecological systems. PNC Bank, the nation's 7th largest bank, declared 6 years ago it would no longer finance coal mining companies that remove mountaintops in Appalachia. A big change. So that's something that was never heard of, in the last 100 years of coal mining. So that's a really great thing to see, that an important private interest banking company is deciding to try to be more in sync with the long-term sustainability of our whole system, eco and financial system. And actually, off on a side note too, I know that Monsanto, who a lot of environmentalists have a lot of reasons not to be happy with, they're coming up with organic fertilizers and some natural things that aren't so bad for the ecosystem. And they're at least, even if you didn't like that company and some of the things they've done, it's important to recognize that they're trying to at least expand their business plan, like look forward 100 years or 40 years or even 20. Like, they cannot keep selling petroleum product derived synthetic pesticides. Those things are going to become obsolete. We cannot keep doing that, and we will figure that out sooner or later. And if that company is still the one selling those, they're not going to do so well. They're going to start seeing their profits go down. So to move into the upcoming market that is more in sync with ecosystems, because that's where things are going. And it may be a very harsh change when we start to realize that we've gone astray, like our climate, too much CO2 in the atmosphere and our climate is warming. We might have to make dramatic changes, but just looking more towards the long term and thinking about that for any company or any group or any designer will help you make a more sustainable choice. Charles Eisenstein wrote a book in 2011 called Sacred Economics. And another permaculture designer I know, Warren Brush, said even just the title of the book sounded like an oxymoron, like economics, sacred. We don't usually think of money as sacred. But if you look at the roots of money, it's an exchange of, like I said earlier, life force, something you put your time and energy and life into, and then you sold it or exchange it for something. It is truly how humans and other organisms, them exchanging resources is part of the miracle of life on Earth and ecosystems. So it is a sacred exchange. And he says there's, in his book, he talks about lots of things, but also about the existence in the past and even some in the present of these economies that are not built on the same kind of economics that we have, like the Federal Reserve Bank. There are gift economies. What we see now is more tribal and indigenous cultures have gift economies where families and clans build status and security by giving excess to others. So they actually increase in their power, or at least their status and their security within their community and culture by giving away, dispensing with the excess to others. That's very different than our society now, where you gain prestige, power, and status the more you garner and keep for yourself, which is very strange when you think of it from an ecological point of view. And Charles Eisenstein also says community, what people often find later in life, sometimes earlier, like I need community. Even though I might be independent or I might be a loner or an introvert, my relationships, my friends, my small community or my big community of people that nourish me is really, really important. I need that in my life. And especially during COVID pandemic, we've realized how important that is to support us. But he says it can't just be something you get your life going, you get your career, you get your family, and then go find some friends to have a community. You do community every Saturday. You go to a drum circle or a church sing. It's like, that's important, but it can't be something you just add on to your already built life, which doesn't have community. It must be the way you create community is by depending on each other, truly needing each other, being vulnerable and having to depend on others. That's true community that will provide you with true strength and security. And again, I don't bring this up to be judgmental about how people have created their lives and made their choices, but what I'm saying is in ecosystems, that's the strength. When organisms and the environment, they are dependent on each other. Without those things, they don't do well or they go away. So it's true interdependency which creates the strength. And Charles Eisenstein is saying the same thing for humans. We're trying to all be really independent and have our own stuff and be secure with all our own bank accounts and investments and long-term retirement and fences, and we're trying to do that because our culture leads us to believe that's where security is. But he's saying from kind of an ecological point of view and from looking at these gift economies that exist, that is less secure and less stable. One of those gift economies is the Trobriand Islands, the Kula ring of the Kula people, and that live on these islands. And it's been studied by outsiders, but the Kula people know about this already, but they are a gift economy. And their system of precious necklace giving, from moving from one island to the next in a circular pattern in this archipelago of islands, is one of the ways they express their and strengthen their gift economy. So yams, the food, the tuber, they're considered a currency and considered an example of wealth and power, and giving those away increases their own wealth and power. So gifting permeates all of the economic, tribal, and moral life of the Trobriand people. And the gifts flow continuously, only stopping in their circulation when someone actually needs to eat a yam or have that status or wealth for a little while. So it's like the ecological idea of source and sink. You've got places where there's kind of let's say a resource vacuum. There's a deficit in resources. Then in this same system, the resources from the sources, the places that have an abundance, those resources move towards the place of deficit. That's how it keeps it stable, and that's reflected in these the Kula people's necklace and bracelet and yams and other things. They're gifting. A little bit more about gift economies. As I was just saying, the gifts in these economies move toward the empty places. And we see that in lots of philanthropic and nonprofit and religious organizations where those organizations give to those that are most needy. And in a sense, that is the most ecological way of existing with other humans and organisms, is to have the abundancy fulfill the deficits and have it circulate. Doesn't always happen, as you know. And that's also what Charles Eisenstein is saying. He said, I'm paraphrasing, he's saying, is it ironic that today's money blocks us from the original intent of resource acquisition? It makes us fearful and protective of what we have, because when giving, there's no cultural assurance we will be replenished. And we get worried and greedy, and resource circulation slows to a deadening halt. So that's true. I mean, for me personally, when I think of giving money away to a homeless person or giving it a larger extent, I'm thinking, well, what would what if I don't get enough? What if I give away and then no one gives back to me when I don't have enough? There's no assurance. And it's not a bad thing to think. We might think we're bad or greedy or selfish, but in a gift economy, I don't think that those thoughts would come through the person's mind as much about selfishness or greedy. It's like this is what's done, and everyone feels secure in the system and fulfilled for the most part. I mean, these communities aren't perfect, but it's something to really think about.